morning, everyone. Welcome to the IPNA Webmaster Series 2020. We have entered into the webinar 10 session. And today we have two eminent speakers, Dr. Roshan George and Dr. Mukta Mandan. The first talk will be by Dr. Mukta Mandan on assessment of renal function test. Dr. Mukta Mandan, she is a professor in charge of pediatric nephrology at Department of Pediatrics, Maulana Azad Medical College at Delhi. And her area of interest is infection and nephrotic syndrome. And she is a past secretary of ISPN, and she is a joint secretary of Pediatric Research and Education Society of India. Over to Dr. Mukta Mandan.
Thank you, Dr. Kalvani, for that kind presentation. So I'm going to the presentation straight away without wasting more time. Okay, is the slide visible? Are these slides visible?
Like you have to click onto your slides, ma'am.
I have clicked in and I have, yeah. Are they visible? Just see.
Yeah, it is visible.
Okay. So very good evening to all of you. And I thank in these COVID times, these are unique platforms to connect to each other. So I'll be talking to you regarding the assessment of renal functions. Now, when we talk about the assessment of renal functions, it is assessment of the glomerular functions, which is primarily by the glomerular filtration rate, and the assessment of tubular functions. And if we look at our renal practice, almost every patient would require an assessment of GFR, whereas tubular functions, we require only in situations where we are expecting some tubulointerstitial damage, certain genetic tubulopathies, in the evaluation of nephrocalcinosis and renal stones. So I'll be talking about these in the subsequent slides. Now, by glomerular filtration rate, we all know that it is the rate at which the ultrafiltrate is formed by the glomerulus, and it is highly variable, and it varies in pediatric age. In pediatric patients, it is based on the age, and as well as it is also based on the creatinine mass or the body mass or the muscle mass. And GFR is primarily determined by the balance between the hydrostatic and colloid osmotic pressures across the glomerular capillaries. And we know that the newborns are born with a GFR of around 30 to 35 ml. And if we see this, that at the neonates are, especially the term neonates, they have a GFR of around 30 to 40 ml, and which gradually improves over time as the renal growth starts occurring. And they reach a peak at around 2 years of age, and after that, the GFR is almost stable. If you look across, most of the term units would have a mean GFR of around 35 to 40 ml. But if you look at the preterm infants, they would have even lower GFRs of around 25 ml. And as you grow across, you'll find that the GFR stabilizes around 2 years of age. And then subsequently, there occurs a peak during puberty. And by 18 years, you achieve stable GFRs. And in adults above 35 years of age, then again, the GFR starts declining. So it's important to evaluate GFR and to know the age-based variations. So what are the various methods of assessment of GFR? We know that urinary clearance, especially the inulin clearance, is one of the gold standards for estimation of GFR as long as we have read the renal physiology. But it is difficult test to do, and it is not easily available at most of these centers. So in most of our clinical practice, we primarily depend upon the endogenous clearance of creatinine, on the creatinine clearance. Apart from that, we have the plasma clearance methods, which utilize dyes like radioisotopes like DTPA, EDTA, etc., and even non-ionic dyes like iohexol. And then more commonly in our routine clinical practice, we use estimation of GFR, which is based on various prediction equations, which I'll be talking later, which are primarily creatinine based. But now there are few equations with the easy availability of cystatin C now. We have predicting equations which are based on both creatinine, cystatin combined equations as well. So when we talk about the clearance methods, clearance we know is the clearance of a substance is defined as the volume of plasma that can be completely cleared of that substance in a unit time. And traditionally, the formula for calculation of urinary clearance is the urinary concentration divided by the plasma concentration into the volume of the urine. And whatever clearance that we calculate out of this has to be normalized to the surface area of the patient, so that we calculate it per 1.73 meters square. So what is the ideal substance which can be used for doing clearance studies? For urinary clearance studies, we all know that the substance should be freely filtered. It should not be reabsorbed or secreted by the tubules. There should be no other extrarenal pathway of metabolism of the substance. It should be completely inert, non-toxic, and should not alter any functions of the body. And Inulin perfectly fits into this criteria. It's a polymer of fructose, and it is found in tubers like Dahlia and artichoke. And but however, if you look at the method of clearance test, well, after an overnight fasting and adequate hydration, you need to give a bolus inulin injection of about 5 gram per 1.73 meter square, and then an infusion has to be given. Continuous infusion has to be given for over 30 minutes, and you need to do serial urinary and plasma samples every 30 minutes for the next 3 hours, and then the clearance can be calculated from the plasma levels and the urinary concentrations and the urinary flow rates, and the total urinary volume also needs to be collected. So multiple urinary and plasma need for multiple plasma samples. Along with that, a need for a continuous infusion of an expensive molecule. It is a difficult objective to achieve in clinical practice. So it's usually used in studies where we compare the newer methods to the gold standard. And short of that, in clinical practice, we depend more on creatinine clearance, where we require a 24 hours urinary output, which we measure for the total creatinine. And we do a plasma creatinine either midway of the collection or at the end of the collection. And then by using the same formula, we can we can calculate the creatinine clearance, and then we can normalize it to the GFR of, and then we can normalize the GFR to the surface area of 1.73 meters square. So that's what we use more commonly in our clinical practice. Now, besides the urinary clearance, the plasma clearance studies are, better placed. They are more convenient. They eliminate the requirement of timed urinary collection, and the rate of decline of the metabolite actually helps you to assess the GFR. And though these also require frequent plasma sampling, and these substances which are most commonly used for plasma clearances are your DTPA and EDTA. And what you really need to do is, in these studies, what we most commonly we are using in our setup is the DTPA dye, and a dose of about 2.5 to 50 million becquerels is injected, which is the dose is essentially dependent on the weight and age of the child. And post injections, most centers we take a baseline sample for plasma and another sample at the end of 2 hours. In some centers, there is a protocol of using the baseline, the 2 hour and a 4 hour sample, especially when you are expecting a low GFR. And you find that the peak rises within the first few minutes. And after that, the plasma clearance of the substance starts. And if there is a uniform expression by the GFR, you can calculate the GFR expression, the GFR of the substance, GFR of the individual from the substance clearance, by looking at the AUCs, and there are nomograms available for these various AUCs from which you can calculate the DTPA GFR. Now, the advantages are that the plasma clearance studies are less cumbersome than the urinary clearance studies, but a disadvantage being that you need to expose the patient to radioactivity. So you can't do it very frequently. Maybe in 2 to 3 years, maybe you can do one clearance studies. But in patients of chronic kidney disease, we often find that we require to assess the GFR very frequently, maybe every 2 to 3 months. So in these situations, probably the better method of estimation would be the bedside equations, which we use commonly for estimation. And for this, the most important marker is the serum creatinine. And we all know that plasma creatinine is a product of metabolism of creatinine and phosphocreatinine and skeletal muscle. And in patients with stable renal function, serum creatinine variability is very less. In fact, the daily variability is only about 8%, and it is highly dependent on the diet also. While creatinine is freely filtered at the glomerulus, it is not reabsorbed. But about 10 to 15% is actively secreted by the tubules. So on a background, if your GFRs are really low, it is possible that your creatinine clearance that you calculate will overestimate your GFRs in the lower brackets. Now, it's very important to know that when we are using these estimatic equations, what are the methods of measurement of creatinine? In the earliest equations of Schwartz et al. And all, the method of creatinine estimation that was being used was the classical Jaffe reaction. And this is a colorimetric reaction test, and in which, other non-chromogens, like the other chromogens, like non-renal chromogens like bilirubin, acetone, glucose, and aminoglycosides also tend to interfere. And due to this interference, they tend to underestimate the creatinine levels. So to overcome this, the new modified Jaffe test has been developed, which is also based on the colorimetry, but there is a differential rate of color development for non-creatinine chromogens. So all these chromogens tend to interfere less in these patients. And the most reliable method probably of creatinine estimation is the enzymatic method, which is used across in Europe and maybe in some parts of US also. But in most of the analyzers that we use in our country, they are based on modified Jaffe method. So if you look at the difference in the serum creatinine values, even in the age group of 2 to 5 years, there can be a difference of at least 0.1 to 0.2 milligram per deciliter if you compare the enzymatic to the modified Jaffe method. So the method of creatinine estimation is also equally important when we use these estimatic equations or bedside equations for GFR. The Schwartz formula that we are all very used to for calculating the GFR gives a K value which is variable across the different. And this equation was essentially developed by Dr. Schwartz when he compared the GFRs using creatinine and inulin clearance in 186 children suffering from chronic kidney disease. And he found that the creatinine clearance had a good correlation with inulin clearance, and it can be used for calculation. But here, when they use this K value, they were using the earlier Jaffe method of estimation of creatinine. Now, with the use of autoanalyzers, where the creatinine estimation is by a more specific method, the K value of the recent formulas is actually going down. And if we look at the equation that we now use more commonly for estimation of GFR is the new modified Schwartz equation, which was provided by the same group on a work on 349 children with chronic kidney disease with a median age of around 10 years. And they used iohexol plasma clearance as the gold standard instead of the inulin clearance. And the estimation of creatinine was by the enzymatic method. And they calculated this K value now as a 0.413. But if you see in most of the analyzers that we are using, we are estimating creatinine by the modified Jaffe method. So in one study from AIIMS, which validated this formula in the Indian population and amongst 197 CKD patients, the reference GFR was measured by the DTPA plasma clearance, and the creatinine estimation method was by the kinetic Jaffe method, which we use in our analyzers. The K value here to be a little higher. That is 0.42. And most of the now they have started using a K value of 0.42 for calculating GFR by the modified formula. Similarly, another study from China, where they compared the GFRs calculated by the original Schwartz equation and the updated and the CKID equation, and the reference here for the measured GFR was again a technetium labeled DTPA GFR estimation. And what they found was that the original Schwartz equation overestimated the GFR by almost 30 mn, whereas for the bedside modified Schwartz equation, this value was around 9.8. And what they found was that the Feiler equation, which is a cystatin C based equation, was the most reliable in this subgroup of patients. So estimated GFR may not be accurate in situations like extremes of age, especially in the neonatal period, in situations of obesity and malnutrition. At least in my clinical practice, I find that at least 30 to 40% of the CKD patients in my clinical practice are suffering from moderate to severe degree of malnutrition, and their creatinines are not that elevated. And in situations of paraplegia and quadriplegia, which we see in patients of spinal defects, etc. So it's important to find out that what are the advantages of using serum cystatin C for calculation of GFR. Cystatin C, as we all know, is a 13 kDa cysteine protease inhibitor. It is produced and secreted by almost all nucleated cells of the body, and it is produced and excreted at a constant rate. It is freely filtered, it is not secreted by the tubules at all, and it is completely reabsorbed by the proximal tubules. So you don't need to look at cystatin C levels in urine. It needs to be evaluated only in the plasma. And there are two methods of estimation, the PTI and PENIA method. In our institute, we have this particle-enhanced turbidometric immunoassay, which is the most commonly available assay for assessment of cystatin C, at least in this part of the world. And but the disadvantage is, while that it is fairly very expensive, it is at least 10 to 15 times more costly than estimation of serum creatinine. But the major advantage is that in children above the age of 1 year, it has relatively stable values and it tends to vary very less. And in patients it has been seen that it's a very useful molecule for early detection of AKI. It has been seen that as compared to serum creatinine, when the GFR falls, the serum cystatin C values rise at least 2 days prior to serum creatinine values. And similarly, but there are disadvantages that the serum levels of cystatin C can be variable in patients of malignancy with the use of steroids and hypothyroidism and inflammatory condition, etc. So they can't be used in patients who are on immunosuppression, transplant, nephrotic syndrome, etc., etc. And it is also a better molecule for estimation of GFR, especially in neonates when serum creatinine is highly unreliable. So if you look at the cystatin C based equation, the most acceptable equation was provided by Guido Feiler in their study when they compared the DTPA clearance and Schwartz equation to cystatin C based equations. And they found that at least the cystatin C overestimated the GFR only by 0.3%, whereas creatinine based equations were overestimating the GFR compared to the DTPA clearance by as high as 10%. So the question arises that which creatinine and cystatin C equations can be reliably used in children? Well, it is recommended that while we should be using the modified Schwartz equation, but it should be locally adapted to the creatinine estimation values that you are using at your center. And as we are using the modified Jaffe technique, so preferably if the K values have been validated in your population, it is better to use that. Otherwise, short of that, you can use the modified Schwartz equation. And combined equations, which are including the values of creatinine as well as cystatin C, are much more reliable as compared to only cystatin C based equations like those provided by Hoek, Bricon, Larson, etc., and those provided by the Zapatelli's group also. So these are the two preferred eGFR equations which are based on cystatin C and creatinine. We have a cystatin C based Schwartz equation, and we also have a CKID based equation which looks at the cystatin C, blood urea nitrogen levels, and as well as serum creatinine values. So how do you really assess the performance of a GFR estimating equation? Well, first thing is the bias, which is the difference between the measured GFR and the estimated GFR. The precision is the standard deviation, which is around the bias. And the accuracy of the equation is the most important factor, which is essential for determining the performance of the equation. It is actually the estimated GFR values which fall within the 30% of the measured GFR values. And some studies also tend to look at the P10% values, but these are very low. So the KDIGO recommends that for calling an estimating equation to be of good quality or a validated equation, its performance should be good in the form that at least 90% of the more than 90% of the values should be in the P30 level. But this is a real high standard to achieve. We recently did a study at our own center at MAMC, and we estimated the GFR by serum creatinine as well as cystatin C based equations in children and adolescents. And the median age of this study group was around 9 years, and 85% were boys. And what we found was we used the measured GFR as creatinine clearance because that is the most easily and accessible clearance study that we can do in a clinical setup. And we compared the original Schwartz to bedside Schwartz to a cystatin C based and a combined equation. And we found that the precision of original Schwartz was very low. The original Schwartz tend to overestimate the values in a very high manner, whereas the bedside Schwartz as well as the combined equations were relatively better. And when we looked at their P30 values, we found that the performance of the bedside Schwartz and the combined equation was almost similar in our setup. And we had about 30% of these patients were malnourished, and about 10 to 15% were also wasted and stunted. But we also found that in the malnourished group of patients, the performance of the cystatin C based alone, as well as the combined equation, was much better as compared to the modified Schwartz. So I think the only advantage of using cystatin C in our setup would be in patients who have relatively higher degree of malnutrition. In other age groups, possibly the bedside or modified Schwartz is good enough. And if you look at the National Kidney Foundation pediatric GFR calculator, it provides the GFR calculations by three equations. One is your modified Schwartz equation, which was provided in 2009, and then you have a cystatin C based equation and you have a combined equation. So if you have availability of all the three parameters like cystatin C, blood urea nitrogen, and creatinine, you can calculate the GFR by all the three, and you can use the value from whichever is the minimum value, you can take it as a GFR for the CKD patients for classifying them into the CKD classification or the stages of chronic kidney disease. So after the GFR, let me come to the assessment of tubular functions. Now we know that the primary function of the tubules, especially of the proximal tubule, lies in the reabsorption of sodium, glucose, phosphate, calcium, bicarbonate, amino acids, etc. Whereas the function of distal tubule is primarily for urinary acidification and urinary concentration. And if you look at the renal tubular disorders, which really require the assessment of urinary functions, the assessment of the tubular functions we need to do tubular functions when you are suspecting a patient to have a renal tubular acidosis, whether a proximal RTA or a distal RTA, if there are clinical features of hypophosphatemic rickets, if you're suspecting tubulopathies like Barter's and Gettleman's, or if there is polyuria, polydipsia, and you are suspecting diabetes insipidus. And apart from that, especially in children who are adolescents and adults, and in adults, there are a lot of tubulointerstitial damage also going on with glomerular damage. And sometimes this tubulointerstitial damage may present earlier than the glomerular damage. So these are also the situations where you would like to assess for renal tubular functions. And in patients of nephrocalcinosis and renal stones, where you would like to know whether there is any hypercalciuria, hyperoxaluria, hypocytopenia, etc., you would like to look at the renal tubular functions as well. So as I said about the glomerular functions, even tubular functions are immature in a newborn. And urine osmolality of a newborn is around only 540 milliosmoles. Similarly, the protein creatinine ratios, even the calcium creatinine ratios are on the higher side. There is the proximal tubules have a lower reabsorptive capacity in a neonate. And gradually over the period of next 6 to 12 months, the urine osmolality also increases and your protein creatinine and calcium creatinine ratios also decline as the tubular functions also mature over this period. And most tubular functions become almost normative by 2 years of age. So some of the factors which can be used for quick assessment of renal tubular functions, we know that we can easily measure the urinary pH, but it is reliable only if it is in a freshly voided urine and should actually be seen within first 30 minutes of collection. On a typical normal diet, the urinary pH is around 6, but varies from 5 to 8. But if there is if you get a pH of less than 5.5, it virtually excludes your renal tubular acidosis. In low urinary pH, stones like uric acid and cystine stones can develop. In high urine pH, you can have a higher predisposition to calcium phosphate stones. A word about specific gravity, which we see very commonly in our urinalysis report. In a normal condition, we know that the specific gravity varies from 1010 to 1030. But in situations of especially in conditions like diabetes insipidus, later stages of chronic kidney disease, ATN, interstitial nephritis, or excessive polyuria, polydipsia, especially in psychogenic polydipsia and all, you can have low specific gravity values. Or actually, for the assessment of all these conditions, it is important to look at the urine osmolality. You should never use the specific gravity as a substitute of urine osmolality, but there are situations where you don't have easy access to osmolality. So in those situations, maybe specific gravity can provide you with some kind of a reasonable alternative. So we know that urine osmolality is measured with the help of a freezing point osmometer, and the normative values are usually between 400 to 1200 milliosmoles per liter, but vary in different parts of the day, the highest being in the first morning urine sample. And in the first morning urine sample, if the child is having polyuria and polydipsia, and if you find that the urinary osmolality is more than 750 milliosmoles per liter, it actually practically rules out diabetes insipidus. And it is also helpful in differentiating your prerenal AKI from ATN. It is useful in evaluation of hyponatremia and SIDH when you find that the urine is more concentrated, but your plasma is actually hypoosmolar and your serum sodiums are also actually low. Another important function of the renal tubules is the reabsorption and excretion of sodium. So fractional excretion of sodium is highly compromised in situations of hypovolemia and especially in pre-renal AKI. And specifically when we see patients of nephrotic syndrome who tend to have hypovolemia, hypoalbuminemia, you may find that your fractional excretions of sodiums are even less than 0.01%. So it often helps you to assess the volume status in these patients. And it is useful in conditions like, hypovolemia, salt-losing nephropathy, cerebral salt wasting, etc. In conditions like RTAs and Barters also, you have plenty of sodium losses in urine, and you'll really have a very high fractional excretion of sodium in these conditions. And if you look at this table, this is a common table which is there across all the emergency medicine books and in nephrology textbooks. And if you look at the parameters that are used for assessing the tubular functions for differentiating pre-renal AKI from ATN, you have the urinary sodiums, you have the urine osmolality, the fractional excretion of sodium, the blood urea to creatinine ratio, and the urine to plasma osmolality. And on a background of pre-renal AKI, urine osmolality is high, and so is your blood urea to creatinine ratio, and so is your urine to plasma osmolality, whereas they are the reverse in patients with ATN. So these sodium values and osmolality can be used for differentiating these situations also. A word about the role of urinary potassium in assessing the tubular functions, especially on a background of hypokalemia. Now, if you know, if you look at the normative values of urinary potassium, they vary anywhere between 20 to 30 milliequivalents per liter. And it is highly variable and it is diet dependent. But if you find that on a background of hypokalemia, your urinary sodium potassiums are also low, that means that there is no renal excretion, there is a renal preservation, and this primarily occurs in conditions like diarrhea, GI loss, decreased intake, especially in malnourished population. If you're having persistent hypokalemia with low renal excretion of potassium, it implies that your intake is actually low. Whereas on the other hand, if you find that there is urinary potassium wasting, now while classically we say that urinary potassium of more than 20 is suggestive of these conditions, but in patients of RTA, Barters, you'll find that the urinary potassiums are pretty high. In Barters, you get values of even up to 80 to 90 milliequivalents per liter. So there is heavy potassium wasting because your NKCCL2 receptor is actually defective. But in situations where, very rarely you may come across a patient who has a has hypokalemia, is hypertensive, and also has urinary potassiums that are high. So here you can suspect, a severe bilateral renal artery stenosis or maybe conditions like hyperaldosteronism. Now, word about transtubular potassium gradient. We know that the most of the potassium excretion occurs in the distal tubules, and it is under the influence of aldosterone. Beyond the distal tubules, especially in the cortical collecting ducts and the medullary collecting ducts, the reabsorption of water occurs, which is primarily mediated by ADH. So whatever potassium excretion has occurred till now, here again, because of the reabsorption of water, the final potassium values that you will get in urine are going to be higher. So if you want to assess the effect of only aldosterone, hypoaldosteronism, then you'll have to probably, that is the reason why we divide the urine to plasma potassium ratio by urine to plasma osmolality, and this is called your transtubular potassium gradient. Now, on a background of hypokalemia, you expect that if your kidneys are conserving sodiums and your aldosterone mechanism is normal, your TTKG should be lower. It should be less than 3. But if you find that on a background of hypokalemia, you're getting a higher TTKG, it implies that your urinary potassium wasting is actually occurring. Similarly, on a background of hyperkalemia, you expect a low TTKG if there is a feature of hypoaldosteronism. So essentially, TTKG looks at the potassium conserving capability of the tubules, which is primarily dependent on the aldosterone. A word about phosphate excretion, which is a very important parameter which you need to evaluate if you come across a patient where you are suspecting hypophosphatemic rickets. So what you need to really look at is the tubular reabsorption of phosphate, which is given as 1 minus the fractional excretion of phosphate. And the best indicator for phosphate excretion is your TMP by GFR, which is essentially, it represents the serum phosphate at which it begins to appear in urine. And what has been seen in patients of hypophosphatemic rickets is that your serum, your TMP GFR are as low as 1.5 to 2. So While in normal children, your serum phosphate levels vary anywhere between 3.6 to 7.6, and only after this the urinary wasting will begin. Whereas in patients of hypophosphatemic rickets, we find that even at values of 1.5 to 2, plenty of fractional excretion of phosphate is happening in the urine. So while you can calculate the you can calculate the TMP GFR by this formula, but there are ready-made Bijovec nomogram which is available in most of the nephrology textbook, for which you require the serum phosphate levels and you require the total reabsorption of phosphate, and from this you can calculate the TMP GFR. And it's very important to document TMP GFR, especially on a background of hypophosphatemic rickets. So the other electrolytes which help you to identify any renal tubular dysfunction is your urinary chloride. In normal individuals, urinary chloride would be anywhere between 15 to 20 milliequivalents per liter. But in conditions of metabolic alkalosis, persistent metabolic alkalosis, specifically due to loss of urinary chlorides, which happens usually in patients of Bartter's and especially in neonatal Bartter's, you may get values of chloride losses tuning to up to even 80 to 100 milliequivalents per liter. So this is a type of metabolic alkalosis which is not responsive to any chloride administration. And in patients where you get a lot of vomitings and gastric losses, and especially also in patients who are having hypertrophic pyloric stenosis, you'll find that your urinary chlorides are less than 10 milliequivalents per liter, and which primarily indicates that your kidneys are actually conserving the chlorides. And this type of hypochloremic metabolic alkalosis, which is because of volume contraction and gastric losses, we know is chloride responsive, and if you give them a bolus of sodium chloride, everything is going to return back to normal. Now, the other electrolytes that you would like to examine for assessment of tubular functions is your urinary calcium values. Well, it is ideal when you are looking at solutes like calcium, uric acid, oxalates, citrates, especially on a background of nephrocalcinosis or stones, it is prudent to take a 24 hours urinary sample. But in children who are non-toilet trained, especially those below the age of 2 to 3 years of age, it is difficult to collect 24-hour samples without catheterizing them. So if you want to avoid that, what you can do is you can look at the urinary spot values. So there are nomograms for both 24 hours as well as spot values for calcium, oxalate, uric acid, cystine, citrate, etc., which can be used for which are often used in clinical practice for evaluation of patients with stones, renal stones, nephrocalcinosis, and nephrolithiasis, etc. A word about proteinuria in renal patients. Well, we know that most of the proteinuria is glomerular in origin and constitutes albumin, and this is mostly which is happening in patients of nephrotic syndrome. But tubular proteinuria can also occur in conditions like Dent syndrome and tubular interstitial damage and chronic tubular interstitial nephritis. And if you look at the 24-hour excretion of urinary proteins in children, it is less than 100 milligrams per day, and only 1/3 is constituted by albumin and 2/3 is constituted by the tubular proteins. So if you find that your urinary proteins are high, but your composition of albumin is really low, then this is more indicative of tubular proteinuria. And this usually happens in defects of proximal tubular defects. It can happen in generalized Fanconi syndrome. It can happen in Dent's disease, etc. So these could be useful in evaluating these patients. So I think that's the last slide. And so just as a brief recap for the students who are attending this session, for the estimation of GFR, while clearance of inulin and creatinine clearance are the best methods available for GFR estimation, they are often cumbersome and are dependent on urinary measurements, vast 24 hours urinary collections. So plasma disappearance of radio-labeled DTP and EDTA are often used instead. But the best way possibly for routine clinical practice is to use the New-Schwartz equation for bedside estimation of GFR. A combined equation which is using the creatinine and cystatin C based formulas would be better for patients, especially if they are malnourished. And assessment of tubular functions is required only in specific conditions like renal tubular acidosis, Bartter's, renal calculi, diabetes insipidus, or tubular interstitial damage. I think that's the last slide. Thank you for being so patient. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for the lucid talk. I think it would be very much helpful for the nephrology residents and pediatricians as well. Thank you so much, ma'am. The next talk is by Dr. Roshan P. George on cystic kidney disease in children. Dr. Roshan George is Associate Professor, Division of Pediatric Nephrology at Emory University and Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. Her specific academic interest is transition of care, biomarkers for detection of early rejection in transplant, social determinants of health and healthcare disparities, and quality improvement and medical education. She has got a number of awards. She has Excellence in Patient Satisfaction Award by Emory University and Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. She's been designated as a Fellow of American Society of Transplantation 2019. She's a Chair and Education Subcommittee, Pediatric Community of Practice, American Society of Transplantation, and she is a Regional Representative of Region 3 Ethic Committee member, and she is a co-chair member Education Committee by American Society of Pediatric Nephrology, September 2020 to 23. Over to Dr. Roshan.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Dr. Roshan. Yeah.
And the slides. Thank you so much, Dr. Kalavani, for that kind introduction. And I really appreciate everybody who's organized this webinar for the invitation, Dr. Namalwar, and especially Dr. Kalavani. So my topic today is cystic kidney disease in children. And I have no disclosures. Objectives for this talk, we hope to go over the pathophysiology of cystic kidney disease, elaborate on the features of hereditary versus non-hereditary cystic kidney disease, and discuss the diagnostic and therapeutic options for various kinds of cystic kidney disease. So broadly dividing cystic kidney disease, we could think of it as hereditary, which could further be divided into autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive, and non-hereditary or sporadic cystic kidney disease. So looking into that a little bit more closely, inherited forms within polycystic kidney disease, we have the autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease and autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease. We can have nephronophthisis, which is autosomal recessive, and again, there's juvenile form, infantile form, and adolescent form. Medullary cystic kidney disease, now this is autosomal dominant, and then cystic kidney diseases that are associated with different syndromes, such as von Hippel-Lindau syndrome, or tuberous sclerosis, or Bardet-Biedl syndrome. Non-hereditary or sporadic cystic kidney disease we'll mention after we talk about inherited ones are acquired cystic kidney disease, medullary sponge kidney disease, and multicystic dysplastic kidney. So this is kind of the roadmap for the talk ahead. So we'll start with pathophysiology, which is mainly ciliopathies in cystic kidney disease. So we know that cilia or flagella are fundamental organelles within the animal kingdom, and these are conserved across species and present over billions of years of evolution from the time of the single-cell protozoa all the way to our human body within the bronchial wall, or also very integral to reproductive system as in flagella of the sperm or the cilia on the fallopian tube. So within each cell, pretty much, except for some blood cells, there are cilia, and many of these are non-motile cilia and are called primary cilia. And for the longest time, this was considered as a vestigial organ for the cell, until almost a couple of decades ago, when more discoveries were made with the study of cystic kidney disease, when a role for the cilia was found. So renal cystic disease are associated with genes that encode proteins within the cilia and that are involved in ciliary function. And it's suggested by mutation identified in both animal and human studies. And we see that there is some genetic heterogeneity with mutations in more than one gene. So looking at the structure of the cilia a little bit further, we see that there is a ciliary axoneme here, a basal body, and then there is interflagellar transport that happens, and calcium signaling is very integral to this transportation. And it's important for the structure of the cilia and normal functioning of these transportation and the signal molecules for cell proliferation, cell differentiation, mitotic spindle orientation, and mainly tissue maintenance organization, and that leads to normal organogenesis. Looking a little bit more in depth into the cilia, we see that there is the basal body, which forms the anchor of the cilia. and into which the ciliary axoneme docks. And then there are all these different molecules that help in attaching with the cilia and also in the transportation that I was talking about. Within the cilia, within this axoneme, there is 9+0 arrangement for the centromere, which is not there in non-motile cilia, and 9+2 arrangement in motile cilia. So this 9+0 is primarily the arrangement we see in primary cilia or non-motile cilia. And at this area where there is the basal body with this axoneme is the transition zone, and near that transition zone is a lot of the structure that will be involved in the abnormalities that are part of the cystic kidney disease. As you see one here, which is the gene which is involved in Bardet-Biedl syndrome. And then as we go talk about the different mutations, we'll talk about that transition zone and the cystoproteins or the proteins within that transition zone that are part of that. So we see that polycystic kidney disease is characterized by abnormal proliferation and differentiation of renal epithelial cells. That was known even before we knew a lot of the cause for that abnormal differentiation. As studies progressed into that, there were some pathways that were featured on why those abnormal proliferation happens, and I'll get into that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. The pathway that was most found to be affected is the Wnt signaling pathway, which regulates development and maintenance of kidneys. So there are two kinds of Wnt signaling. One is the canonical Wnt signaling, which leads to cell proliferation, and the non-canonical or PCP Wnt signaling, which causes cell differentiation. So functional cilia, which is normal, suppresses the canonical Wnt signaling, and it tightly regulates the Wnt signal balance. So what ends up happening here is that within the cilia, as we talked about, this basal body is here and calcium signaling. When fluid comes, when there is flow, the cilia moves, and this causes the calcium to be released. There's normal calcium signaling and normal proliferation of tissue homeostasis. On the other side, what we talked about just before with the Wnt signaling, there is normal planar cell polarity simulation. The Wnt molecules activate this pathway, which is the frizzled pathway, and this causes activation of this molecule called disheveled, and that goes near the cell membrane, and that inhibits for destruction of beta-catenin complex, and this doesn't go into the nucleus. So both of these sides of the pathway cause normal upregulation of the planar cell polarity, which causes normal polarity of the cells, and downregulates canonical Wnt pathway. This pathway you'll also see sometimes in tumor generation and study of oncology, cell and micro histology of that. When there is an abnormality in the ciliary body function, such as abnormal cystoproteins as in NPHP or Bardet-Biedl syndrome, this is for nephronophthisis, this normal pathway doesn't happen. The calcium signaling doesn't happen. Even when there is flow, the cilia doesn't move normally. So then on the other side, the Wnt pathway attaches with frizzled, and you see that the disheveled molecule is not activated. So the beta-catenin complex is still, there is destruction of that, causing beta-catenin everywhere that enters into the nucleus, and the abnormal canonical Wnt pathway gets upregulated, and there is abnormal cell division and proliferation. To look at this a little bit more succinctly, if you look at mitotic spindle orientation, when there is normal ciliary function, the spindles are aligned on top of each other, there is tubular elongation. When, because of all that abnormality near the basal body of cystoproteins, when there is defective planar cell polarity, there is abnormality of the ciliary function. Instead of normal tubular elongation, there is disorganized cellular proliferation causing tubular dilatation, which leads to cyst formation. And this is what forms the basis of all cyst formation in all cystic diseases, and it comes down to these ciliopathies and more specifically abnormalities of the cystoprotein within that transition zone near the basal body and the origin of the cilia. So there are some other pathways that are implicated with this ciliopathies, which are the sonic hedgehog signaling pathway, or the platelet-derived growth factor receptor alpha pathway, or the mammalian target of rapamycin or mTOR pathway. And these are some of the pathways, and there are many other pathways that are being looked into at labs using animal experiments. So now we can jump into the specific cystic kidney diseases and start with ADPKD, which is autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease. This is the most common inherited kidney disease with an incidence of 1 in 400 to 1 in 1,000, and there is cystic dilatation in all parts of the nephron. The genes responsible are PKD1, which is more common and present in chromosome 16, and this encodes for the sister protein polycystin 1. And PKD2 gene, which is less common, 10 to 15%, which is on chromosome 4, and involves polycystin 2. The clinical manifestations of autosomal kidney disease most commonly occur a little bit later. So in children, we may not see all the manifestations, and it usually more commonly happens in the 3rd and 5th decade. You can see hypertension very commonly in up to 44% of children. Extrarenal manifestation is very common. You have hepatic cysts, you can have mitral valve prolapse, colonic diverticuli, and the dreaded cerebral aneurysms that these patients can have. Hyperlipidemia is also another problem, and esophageal and gastric varices can cause quite a lot of GI symptoms in these patients. Diagnosis, usually the starting point is getting an ultrasound. You'll see diffuse hyperechogenicity, enlarged kidneys, and with cysts, which are usually bilateral. Prenatal ultrasound can be very normal a lot of times, but sometimes you can also see some enlarged kidneys with echogenicity. And in this aspect, it's really important to get a good family history. So if either parent has ADPKD, the finding of enlarged echogenic kidney confirms prenatal diagnosis, even if you do not see cysts at that time. Just seeing large kidneys that are echogenic is enough if there is parental history. A single cyst also in a child at risk, meaning if there is again parental history, that confirms diagnosis as well. CT and MRI helps look at the cysts much more closely and is also better in terms of identifying much smaller cysts up to 2 millimeters in size. Consortium for Radiologic Imaging Studies of Polycystic Kidney Disease called CRISP did a study and looked at kidney and cyst volume and found that total kidney and cyst volumes increased by about 5% annually. And in patients who have a kidney volume of over 1500 ml, there is a decline in GFR. What would we do if there is not a good family history that's available? Sometimes ultrasound of asymptomatic parents may be needed if we are suspecting ADPKD. And for this, I just put together some of the criteria that was part of this unified criteria for ultrasound diagnosis of ADPKD. So in case the parents are made to get ultrasound, we know that for parents who are, or adults who are 15 to 39 years old, they have to have 3 or more cysts in 1 or both kidneys. As the age grows older, the per kidney ultrasounds is enough, at least 2 or more cysts in each kidney, or over 60 years, at least 4 cysts per kidney. Biopsy generally is not indicated. It's a clinical diagnosis, and ultrasound helps confirm the diagnosis, and in some cases CT or MRI. But if you do an ultrasound, you would see cysts basically within the histology, and this is basically present all through the kidneys. Genetic testing is what is recommended, and if available, gives you more specific diagnosis, and you look at the PCKD1 and PCKD2 gene that we discussed previously. Unfortunately, there's no specific proven treatment in pediatrics yet for ADPKD. We all initiate supportive measures, and it's really important to start by good blood pressure control. ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers are very good initial agents, and this slows the progression of the chronic kidney disease. Hyperlipidemia should be treated with diet modification, and there's also some role of statins separately from treating the hyperlipidemia in treating or reducing the progression of cyst formation. Again, in pediatrics, that role is not very well studied. But if you detect hyperlipidemia, that is definitely a consideration to start statins. Increased fluid intake to suppress ADH helps reduce the cyst formation, caffeine restriction, amiloride, and definitely symptomatic treatment for pain and infection. Tolvaptan, or vasopressor receptor antagonist, is now approved for treatment of adults with ADPKD. This causes decreased cyclical AMP and inhibits cystogenesis in animal models and has been shown to have benefits in adult studies. Somatostatin is another studied medication which may reduce renal and liver cysts. A study which used about 34 patients with ADPKD and 8 with autosomal dominant cystic disease found that there was reduction in liver volume and no increase in kidney volume at 1 year. So it's a short study using somatostatin. mTOR inhibitors such as sirolimus has also been shown to have some benefit, even though with sirolimus, the study that was published about 10 years ago comparing with placebo didn't show a huge difference. There was no decrease in renal growth at 18 months and no difference in GFR. However, using everolimus, a study that was published in patients who were had CKD 2 or 3 and ADPKD and a high renal volume, the everolimus group had slower increase in the total renal volume, but there was not a lot of corresponding increase in GFR that was improved, but the kidneys didn't grow as fast on everolimus. So bottom line with that is that at this point, supportive treatment is the mainstay, and tolvaptan is used in some adult patients. So going on to the autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease. This is less common than ADPKD, 1 in about 40 to 50,000, typically presents in infancy. And the gene involved here is PKHD1, polycystic kidney and hepatic disease gene, on chromosome 6. And this encodes for polyductin or fibrocystin. There's non-obstructive dilatation of collective tubules in the renal medulla. So this is very much focused onto the collecting tubules, which are dilated, and the kidneys may be asymmetrically enlarged. There is 2 stages of presentation or ages of presentation. One could be in the neonatal period or in the childhood or adolescent period. And neonatal respiratory compromise or oligohydramnios is common with this, as you would see with Porter's species in these patients. Some kids a little bit older who have hyponatremia, concentrating defect, metabolic acidosis, and also pyuria. Hypertension is common early, including in the neonatal period, where the blood pressures can be significantly elevated. Because of the respiratory compromise and abdominal distension, this leads to further respiratory abnormalities needing further intervention. End-stage kidney disease usually occurs around 15 years of age. Older children have, where it is manifested, may have more hepatic symptoms. 23% have variceal bleeding by 12 years, and hepatosplenomegaly and hypersplenism are also seen in these patients. Hepatic involvement with cysts, fibrosis, and portal hypertension is part of the congenital hepatic fibrosis in these patients. And just a word about this, because again, there is abnormality in the cell proliferation, which converts into abnormalities you see in the ductal plate. So here in D, you see the normal ductal plate with connecting bile ducts around the portal vein, whereas in E, which is abnormal proliferation, you see that there is dilated bile ducts, and these are branching abnormally, and there are increase in numbers as compared to the normal one. So in these patients with this point, is important to do periodic endoscopes also to find esophageal varices or rule out portal hypertension. Prenatally, ultrasound shows enlarged kidneys with increased echogenicity. Again, you may not see a lot of cysts, but enlarged kidneys and especially enlarged, sometimes above 2 standard deviations greater than normal, is really abnormal and should prompt the thought about diagnosis of ARPKD. Compared to a normal collecting duct, where you see here, the collecting duct in ARPKD, there is a lot of abnormal dilatation here within the collecting duct. Management, again, is directed towards complications here and infections, kidney stones, hypertension, pain, portal hypertension. These are the main complications that we should consider specific treatment for. Yearly screening is important, especially blood pressure measures, and also UA, ruling out proteinuria, hematuria, and also importantly, looking at growth and nutrition in these patients and following renal function panel. End-stage kidney disease in either one of these patients requires obviously renal replacement therapy, nephrectomy if associated with complications. And I will say that many of these ARPKD patients who have significant pulmonary abnormalities may need nephrectomy early on, even as early as in the neonatal period, if that is the enlarged kidneys are causing respiratory compromise. Sometimes a staged nephrectomy with a single unilateral nephrectomy followed with bilateral nephrectomy and putting the patient on PD is the way to go in early detection, such as in newborn babies. Transplantation, the good news is that this does not recur after transplant, and if renal replacement therapy is required for these patients, then transplantation is a consideration. So a word about the differences between ADPKD and ARPKD that we already talked about, just to summarize them. ADPKD is more common. There is a later onset of end-stage kidney disease, even though both are at risk for going into end-stage kidney disease. In ADPKD, we see hepatic cysts and other systemic manifestations. ARPKD, it's hepatic fibrosis that we talked about with abnormal portal vein. There's symmetric enlargement of kidneys with cysts in all areas of the nephron in ADPKD, whereas in ARPKD, it's asymmetric, and the most area that is affected is the collecting duct. Hypertension, again, is present in both. In ARPKD, it can be quite severe. So going back to the location of the cysts, as we talked about, in ADPKD, the cyst is everywhere, can be in any part of the kidney, whereas in ARPKD, it's mainly in that collecting duct. So shifting gears and moving on to nephronophthisis. This is within that inherited disorder group, autosomal recessive disorder. As we talked about, it can be infantile, juvenile, and adolescent. And juvenile nephronophthisis is most common. The clinical features, polyuria, polydipsia, reduced urinary concentrating ability, are all kind of non-specific features of these cystic kidney diseases. Again, these patients can have renal insufficiency, and that can be without any of signs of nephritis-like picture, obviously. Anemia is one thing that is a little bit different in these patients with nephronophthisis. Ultrasound again shows hyperechogenicity, loss of corticomedullary differentiation, and medullary cysts. If we look at the various causes of nephronophthisis, there is a lot of overlap that happens, except for NPHP2 that causes infantile nephronophthisis. So infantile nephronophthisis mostly affects the tubulointerstitial region, causing nephritis, and there is severe hypertension associated with this. End-stage kidney disease is early, by 2 years. And as we talked about when we talked about the ciliary function and cell polarity, that ciliary function is also important to determine organogenesis and orientation. So because of that abnormality in these patients, you can see situs inversus. Mutation is in NPHP2 gene, and this encodes inversin, which is the sister protein. Juvenile and nephronophthisis, the incidence is kind of equal in both girls and boys, which is not very usual with other kidney diseases. Mutation can be in any of the nephronophthisis genes from 1 to 8, except, as we mentioned, it's not NPHP2, which is in infantile NPH. adolescent nephronophthisis, end-stage kidney disease is, as the name suggests, later in the adolescent young adult age group, and mutation is commonly in the NPHP3 gene. So recently, when looking at these distribution of the genes, up to 70%, you may not able to find any mutation at all, but the most common mutation that is found is the nephronophthisis 1 gene mutation, and everything else is in that 3% or less than 3% range. Just to go back and review our cell structure with the ciliopathy, for recalling that these nephronophthisis genes are present within that structure, which goes from that nucleus to the basal body and into the ciliary anchor. So we see that the different nephronophthisis genes or nephrocystin proteins are located around in that area. And then you have affecting these causing ciliopathies. And just to mention, throughout this area, other ciliopathies are these named syndromes that we have mentioned a few of them, and we will mention a few as we go on into the presentation. So when we look at the different subclasses or categories of nephronophthisis, there are some named syndromes that are associated with other findings, which are extrarenal. So Senior-Loken syndrome, there is retinitis pigmentosa. And as you can see in this picture, this is a normal fundus. And here with this Senior-Loken syndrome with the retinitis pigmentosa, there is paler optic disc, and you have these abnormal pigmentary migration and abnormal vessels. And this is specifically due to effect on the NPHP5 and NPHP6 mutation. These code for primary cilia and also the ciliary function in the photoreceptors, causing these retinal abnormalities. Another one of these named syndromes is Joubert syndrome, which is characterized by neurologic disorders with congenital hypotonia, developmental delay. There is oculomotor apraxia and abnormal respiratory pattern. And the specific sign you see in MRI is the molar tooth sign. This is an MRI cut through the superior cerebellar peduncle, and you can see this molar tooth sign as compared to a normal slice of that brain. And this is Joubert syndrome with these neurologic disorders. There are several other named syndromes, as we mentioned, Meckel-Gruber syndrome. There is polydactyly and central nervous system malformation. Saldino-Mainzer syndrome, this is characterized by bone abnormalities. So good exam looking at their fingers and bones important. Cogan syndrome, which is isolated oculomotor apraxia. Jones syndrome, which is thoracic dystrophy, and Ellis-Von Crevald, and Rhine syndrome, which is retinitis pigmentosa, hypopituitarism, and skeletal dysplasia. These are some of the named syndromes, but as you can see, as more and more genes are being detected and they find more abnormalities, it is likely that other syndromes will be added on to this nephronophthisis syndromes. Again, biopsy is not indicated in these patients, but if done, you'd see interstitial fibrosis, multi-layer thickening with lamination of tubular basement membrane, with lots of abnormalities in the basement membrane. Genetic testing is the way to go if available, and this basically gives a little bit of framework, because if it's early onset, like we talked about, it's very likely that it's nephronophthisis 2 by NPHP2 or infantile nephronophthisis. If the child is older, then we could potentially look at other systemic manifestations such as retinitis pigmentosa or cerebellar ataxia, and then kind of figure out which abnormal gene could be the possibility. As the presentation age increases, there is more likelihood that CKD will be the presenting manifestation, and you would end up doing biopsy as part of the workup. So that is why that is more common in older patients. Again, there is no effective prophylaxis or treatment for these. Supportive care is the mainstay of treatment and treating renal insufficiency. As we talked about in ADPKD, B2 receptor antagonists such as tolvaptan has shown some promise. There's some renal cystic phenotype of mice that have equivalent NPHP type 3 that have shown improved kidney function, or the cysts formation was mitigated by the antagonist of V2 receptors, and also in PKD2 mice, as we talked about, that we have seen this. And this was mediated by cyclical AMP levels. Research is again ongoing in many of these conditions. So we talked about polycystic kidney disease, nephronophthisis, and just a word about medullary cystic kidney disease, which is autosomal dominant. What we should remember about this is a different mutation in MCKD1 or MCKD2 gene, and they also have those same concentrating abnormalities, polyuria, salt wasting, but these are a little bit milder and they appear more towards adulthood, but there may be some adolescents who may present with this, and the characteristic feature here is that they may have hyperuricemia, and this is due to UMOD gene mutation. And some patients, as they grow older, may also have gout. These patients usually end up presenting with some for CKD, so you may also just see bilaterally shrunken kidneys. The medullary cysts may not be very obvious at the time of presentation. Treatment of complications and specifically of hyperuricemia is recommended in these patients. So that kind of combines and completes our discussion on the hereditary part, and now we jump on to non-hereditary or sporadic cystic kidney disease, three of which I will discuss today: acquired cystic kidney disease, medullary sponge kidney disease, and multicystic dysplastic kidney. So medullary sponge kidney disease is not that common, but there is tubular dilatation of collecting ducts in the medullary pyramid, and the renal cortex is usually spared. You'll have, again, polyuria, hypercalciuria, and renal tubular acidosis. These patients do end up going into chronic kidney disease, and end-stage kidney disease is also sometimes seen, even though it is not that common in younger patients. Multicystic dysplastic kidney is again one of the other acquired ones or non-hereditary ones, and these are multiple non-communicating cysts separated by dysplastic parenchyma. This is usually unilateral, and prevalence is in about 1 to 4,000 or so births. There is very common association of renal anomalies, such as vesicoureteral reflux, and management is conservative. You basically monitor to make sure that there is normal or compensatory growth of the normal functioning kidney, and most of the times this multicystic dysplastic kidney regresses and becomes atrophic over time. So going back into remembering that systemic manifestations are present with most of these cystic kidney disease, the one that is shaded a little bit on the pink side here are the ones that are associated with primary cilia. You'll see abnormalities in the eye, in the bone, in the liver, and heart. And some of these may be just ancillary associations that you're seeing in these patients, and this spreads the whole gamut of cystic kidney disease. This is a very nice paper which is in a review which is literally in press at this time, but goes through the ciliopathies and the specific conditions with these and systemic manifestations. Genetic testing, as I had mentioned, just another quick line about it, is something that, if available, should be very specific for diagnosing this, especially for ADPKD with PKD1 and PKD2 genes. Direct DNA analysis can also be done, and next generation sequencing now is helping sort out all these different cystoproteins and specific genes associated with other conditions such as nephronophthisis or the syndromes associated with that. Within that, remember that we are going back into that cilia centrosome complex, and there are lots of other genes that may be involved, and some of these named syndromes have specific genes that have been identified and can be found in diagnostic studies, but because this is such a complex structure and most of these findings have happened over the last 2 decades, there is more to come with these. So in summary, ciliopathies have variable presentations and phenotypes. It's really important to get a good detailed family history and have a nice pedigree to remember where which generations are affected, and what the hereditary pattern of this is. Detailed physical exam is really important, especially if there are worries about extrarenal manifestations. Looking at the eye, making sure that bone abnormalities are looked at is important. And then the initial part of diagnosis is usually with imaging, starting with ultrasound, although CT, MRI will give a better, clearer delineation of these cysts. Genetic testing may be helpful. And then PKD Foundation, pkdcure.org has a lot of good information for families if they need to look into it for their affected child or affected family member. With that, I'll stop my talk here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roshan. It was excellent talk. You were I got better clarity on cystic kidney disease of the kidney. I had my own personal doubts, but it was better clarified. Thank you so much. Now, can we take up the questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mukta madam, you're there online. Can we take up the questions?
Yeah, sure. But I'm just trying to go that we need to go to the chat box.
No, I'll be reading out the questions for you, ma'am.
Okay, fine. Please do that.
The first question is to Dr. Mukta Mandan. Is EGFR enough for dosing of chemotherapy or need to be done by MDTPA?
No, I think for
The
if
question
you're
is not
looking
all
at
that clear.
I think she must be
Are you
asking
getting the
that
question?
before giving administration of chemotherapy, do you require a GFR estimation by doing a radio
By
plasma
DTPA,
clearance or
okay.
by a bedside equation? I think a bedside equation is good enough. If you compare, like we've also done studies at our center, and if you look at the studies from other centers also, the modified Schwartz equation is very close to your DTPA plasma clearance. And at least most of these studies have shown that P30 values vary anywhere between 70 to 85%. So they are acceptable equations. So there is no need to do a DTPA clearance. DTPA clearance probably would be required in a patient, if somebody's of Wilms tumor, he's had a nephrectomy of one side. So in these situations, probably a DTPA clearance would be required. If the ultrasound wise, the kidneys are absolutely normal, then an estimation of GFR by doing by a modified Schwartz equation is good enough.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. And the next question is, even though patients with Bartter syndrome have got high renin levels, but still they are normotensive. Can you tell us the mechanism behind that?
See, Bartter's, they are losing a lot of sodium, potassium, and chloride. So anybody who loses a lot of sodium into the urine tends to be hypotensive only. He will be normotensive to hypotensive because the polyuria is very extensive. And Bartter, specifically neonatal Bartter, is a very severe disease where you require, in the initial parts, especially if they present in infancy, you require a lot of normal saline infusion to bring them to normal level. So they would usually have, because of the low sodium concentration, you would expect only normotension or hypotension, not hypertension. Transient hypertension may occur if there is volume concentration, like there is volume contraction, and which may cause a reduced ischemia to the kidneys. That is the only situation probably where they would manifest as hypertension, but majority would present as hypotension.
Okay, fine, ma'am. Thank you so much. Next question is to Dr. Roshan. In ADPKD child, ACE inhibitor should be started even without overt proteinuria and normal BP?
So that's a great question. I would say that it's important to balance how effects of hypotension, if that is a risk, will affect kidney function. So there is not any specific study that says that in kids, ACE inhibitors without proteinuria or hypertension helps reduce the spread or growth of cysts. But if the blood pressure can tolerate it, it means that you could potentially try at a very small dose, but it's important to monitor blood pressure so that they are not going into hypotension and causing more perfusion related damage to the kidneys. So to be very honest, in my own patients, I have been reticent to start it if there is no findings that are abnormal. especially in younger kids, we just monitor them. I do tell them to drink water, even though I would say that the water part to reduce ADH stimulation is huge amounts, like 6 to 10 liters, which is truly not practically possible. So personally, in my practice, I have not started ACE inhibitor if there are no findings, but if there is proteinuria or any little excuse and the blood pressure can tolerate it, I'll start a very small dose.
Okay. Okay, thank you, ma'am. Next question is to Dr. Roshan. Can we use everolimus for 2.5 years old male child with tuberous sclerosis with ADPKD and very large unilateral renal cyst?
Yes, no, that's a good question. ADPK, I mean, tuberous sclerosis with that, especially CNS manifestations like epilepsy or so, this everolimus is used in kids who are older than 2, but definitely it is something to be tried if they have such large renal cysts. I don't know if this particular patient has any CNS manifestations, but if there are other cysts or abnormal glial cells or something like that, then definitely it is used, and there's some literature around that too. So targeting around like 4 to 7 or so for the levels.
Okay. So like everolimus is indicated only when they have CNS manifestation, is it so?
So yes, most of the literature is around that, but if the kidneys are really very large, then it's potentially you could try it, because the mTOR inhibitor pathway is something that is affected in that, but the most of the literature is around CNS epilepsy or such manifestations that with seizures, there's benefit with everolimus.
Okay, okay, thank you, ma'am. And the next question is to Dr. Roshan. What is the current guidelines for usage of tolvaptans in children with ADPKD?
So there is not any guidelines that I am aware of for use of tolvaptan in children. It is being used in adults. That is also through mostly studies that they are enrolled in where monitoring happens. But I think the bigger concern with use in children is electrolyte abnormalities with tolvaptan, and if there is they're on it, there's potential that they may have worsening of with what fluid intake that the kids may not have as much control over. Severe hyponatremia can happen, but there are not any guidelines. We are not giving it to our patients also because our patients, very few of them have such severe manifestations in the pediatric age group. So most of the manifestations happen once they leave us and go into their 30s or 40s, and by then the adults have some guidelines related to study populations that they're placing these tolvaptan on their adult patients. So we are not using it in kids.
Okay, in your personal practice, you have never started any child on tolvaptan?
I have not started anybody on tolvaptan for ADPKD, no. We have for chronic, some other condition-related SIADH, we have used that for oncologic patients who have been with tumors for symptom relief, some in very few selected patients, but no, not in ADPKD.
So in case if you are going to use tolvaptans, what is the maximum duration you can use? That is my own personal question.
No, that's a very good question. We have only used it for a very short period of time, and most of these kids are in the ICU, so they're being monitored really closely. We have not even discharged a patient on tolvaptan home. So I would, especially in pediatric population, I would say that we have to be very closely monitoring those patients.
Okay. Thank you. And the next question again is to Dr. Roshan. What is the incidence of cholelithiasis in ARPKD?
Oh, that's a very good and specific questions, which I will be honest to say that I don't have the specific answer to in terms of the incidence. In ARPKD, you do see a lot more portal hypertension and hepatic fibrosis, cholelithiasis. There have been a few, but I don't think it's as numbers that is as common to need like surgery or anything like that, but I will say that I do not have that number of that incidence off the top of my head.
Okay, fine. And the next question is to Dr. Mukta Mandan. What K is normal recommendation for eGFR? Is it 0.413 for all ages?
Yes. The study which they had quoted, Schwartz, JG et al., they had used all age groups. So it is across all the age groups, it's 0.413. So that is convenient to use as compared to the traditional old formula that we were using and using different cutoffs for different age groups.
For newborn babies, what is the thing you use, ma'am?
For newborn babies, we are using still, now we have started using this point. Yeah, we still, because this study of Schwartz did not involve the neonates. So for the neonates, probably it is okay to use that 0.55 variation of the Schwartz formula. But in the children, because this was more for children between 2 to 18 years of age. So in those, you can use the GFR of 0.413. Anyway,
Okay,
neonates
fine,
we
ma'am.
were using 0.35 for preterm and 0.44 for the term babies. But what we have seen over the years, Dr. Kalwani, that the serum creatinine values are actually going gradually down. We find that even in normal children, we find serum creatinines as low as 0.2, 0.3. So I think, like there is a need to relook at the K values individually with the machines and also. And that was the reason why when we looked up at in our own study, we found that there was a good correlation of creatinine clearance with our bedside equation, which is using a K value of 0.413, although our patient group was 2 to 18 years of age. So possibly if we have more studies in those neonatal period, then we would be able to. And especially it's a little difficult in neonate period because the GFR is very fluctuant. So especially in first 2 weeks, the serum creatinines are reflective of the maternal creatinine values. And after that, the GFR is picking up. So it would be highly variable. So I guess if we use the K values of 0.4 and 0.35 for preterms, they are fine.
Okay, fine, ma'am. Thank you. And the next question is to Dr. Roshan. For ADPKD child with a positive family history of stroke and cystic disease, do you routinely do neuroimaging in the affected children, but without hypertension and neurological symptoms?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's always tricky when these family history of strokes happen. And the recommendation is that neuroimaging should be done for people who have a positive family history of aneurysms, for people who have history of like TIA or stroke themselves. In fact, even they go as far as saying that if there is significant headaches, neuroimaging should be considered. Certain, especially adults, and here because the kids also start working in a younger age, if they are driving or for like pilots and all that, they do recommend neuroimaging. So yes, if there is a positive family history with aneurysms that have led to strokes, obviously with positive family history of ADPKD, neuroimaging is recommended. And then the next question comes, how often? And then you read up, the literature suggests that you should do it as often as every year. So that becomes a little bit more, cost benefit ratio if you think of imaging every year. But at least if there is a family history that there has been manifestation of an aneurysm like a stroke, it is highly recommended, even without any neurologic symptoms, because as high as, if I remember correctly, up to 20% of patients who have a positive family history of aneurysms, in that range, up to 20% can have aneurysms themselves. And so may be prudent to get neurology or neurosurgical consultation for the patient if you diagnose it.
Okay, fine. Next question is to Dr. Roshan. Role of ACE inhibitors in ARPKD, does it help in reducing the cyst progression?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because we know that ACE inhibitors in ARPKD helps with obviously hypertension, which is a huge problem in these patients. And there's some animal data that shows that it helps with hepatic fibrosis. But I am not aware of any studies that show that it is reducing cyst progression in these ARPKD patients. But I highly recommend using it, especially ARPKD, because of hypertension being such a big issue. And this is relative to other antihypertensive medications, better choice.
Okay, okay, thank you, ma'am. Next question is, I think you have already answered this question about the benefits of tolvaptan in ADPKD. What is your personal experience? I think you have already answered this. You said you are not using in your personal practice. The next question is to Dr. Mukta Mandan. While evaluating a child with a normal anion gap, acidosis with a positive urine anion gap, urine pH may not match with your working diagnosis of distal RTA. pH comes as 6. Should we still take it as distal RTA? What should be the cutoff of your urine pH in such situations?
Yeah, I think if the pH is 6, you'll still consider your anion gap is anyway coming as positive. So it is indicative of a distal RTA only if you are having a blood gas which is showing clear-cut acidosis. So cutoff of if it's less than 5.5, you would rule out completely distal RTA. But if it's 6, I would still keep a possibility of distal RTA.
Okay, okay, fine. Thank you, ma'am. I think we are done with our questions. I have few personal questions, to
Yeah.
Dr. Roshan. In medullary sponge kidney, what is the confirmatory test you do?
Yeah, that's a good question, because in the past you do some IVP, which shows like the drooping lily and all that, which we don't.
That is cluster of grapes appearance.
Yes, exactly. You don't do much of that now, at least here, even though our senior physicians will tell you that that is kind of one of the best tests to identify it. We now just do ultrasound and, if needed, CT scan, and our radiologists kind of read it as there is likelihood of it, and it's based a lot more on clinical findings. Also, there is a lot of involvement of the medulla without involvement of the cortex, so that is something that you can kind of differentiate with medullary sponge kidney, but there's not one specific confirmatory test that we do here.
So ultrasound abdomen is not a confirmation to medullary sponge kidney, right?
I think it will show these characteristics, but because cystic kidney diseases are so wide and you can start the cysts in the medullary region in some nephronophthisis and other conditions also, it's not very specific. If everything else matches up, you have nephrocalcinosis and other things systemically matches up, then you can say that, but it's not a very specific like a confirmation gold standard test. But that's all we have at this time.
Okay, okay, fine. Thank you. I think we have got one more question to go. Is late termination of pregnancy advised if antenatal scans show bilateral hyperechoic kidneys?
That's a tough one, because I think it's very much a decision with the families, right? I mean, it depends here. We do have kids who have a very high risk of ARPKD who are born. We do nephrectomy early, do PD, they're transplanted, and they live on. So I wouldn't recommend one thing or the other. It is truly a lot of discussion with the families, because it's not an easy road, especially a neonate with nephrectomy on PD is very tough for families to deal with, and this is something that really needs to be discussed very, very carefully with the families, what their resources are and what they can actually accomplish with small babies who are sick.
Okay, fine, ma'am. I think we have one more question to Dr. Mukta Mandan. What is the difference between Fanconi syndrome and proximal renal tubular acidosis? Probably it's a very common question. I think you can answer, ma'am.
Yeah, Fanconi is generally, we say, when you have the entire involvement of proximal tubule and you have a generalized aminoaciduria and all that. Whereas in proximal RTA, if you look at primarily the involvement is of renal tubular dysfunction. So I think that's when you say Fanconi's, you are thinking of the entire proximal tubule which is defective. So you'll have a lot of phosphaturia, glucosuria, and proteinuria as well, because multiple these channels are involved in that. So I think that's the difference.
Okay. I think we are done with the questions as well. We had an excellent discussion, and the one main significant point is today we were on time.
Yeah.
We were able to finish on time. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Such
Thank
a
you,
call.
everybody. Yeah.
Thank you,
Yeah.
ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Okay.
Roshan, for the excellent talk. Thank you, madam, for covering up the basics of renal function test. Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am. Bye-bye.
Thank
Okay.
you. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.